What I wanted to talk about is some of the things that we've actually seen at the border that are the consequence of the things Art was talking about. Fraud in the asylum system, especially in people coming across the Mexican border, is endemic. The overwhelming majority of people claiming asylum are regular migrants. They're seeking economic opportunity, they're seeking, stability and order. They're not fleeing persecution under the definition that exists in the law. Todd Bensman has done a bunch of reporting on location on this subject, and in a trip earlier this year, he went down to the Costa Rica-Nicaragua border and spoke to a bunch of people, Haitians and others, who were heading north. And because they hadn't gotten to the U.S. border yet, they were actually telling the truth. And he spoke to one Haitian young man who had lived in Chile for many years in South America. And he said, why'd you move to Chile? What's the appeal? And he says, life was 1,000 times better in Chile than in Haiti, he told Todd. So the natural question, next question, Todd asks, so why'd you leave Haiti? What are you doing here heading to the United States? And apparently he chuckled a little bit and said, but life's 1,000,000 times better in the United States. This is unquestionably using the asylum system as a means of conventional immigration. And one of the stratagems, or part of the strategy in passing that initial hurdle, the credible fear interview that Art referred to, which is almost everybody passes it. Really, I exaggerate, I kind of joke a little, but it's only a slight exaggeration to say that it's basically they're just trying to screen out people who think Mickey Mouse is talking to them through their dental work. Pretty much, if you come up with something vaguely plausible, you'll make it. But one of the things that would disqualify you is some kind of evidence that you're established in another country. For instance, if you're Haitian, that you're already living in Brazil or in Chile. And because of that, the smugglers have instructed their customers to throw away their IDs from Chile or Brazil because they have status there. They have work permits, they have the equivalent of either something like asylum status or temporary protected status in our law. And in fact, a number of these documents were actually passports issued to the children of these migrants who were born after they got to Brazil or elsewhere. So, firm resettlement is pretty clearly what's happening there, and so they throw them away right before they cross the river in order not to be found out. One of our fellows wrote in a blog post a few months ago that we should be paying somebody to go over to the Mexican side and collect up all these documents so that we can, sort through and find out who is who and who's actually telling the truth about not being resettled in another country and who's lying. And even though we talk a lot about people coming from Haiti, and in fact there's a lot of that was in the news quite a bit, the migrants coming across the southern border and pretending that they're asylum seekers come from, most recent count, 160 different countries. I kind of joke about that. What are the other 30 countries? What's wrong with them? But my sense is it's probably like Vatican City and Andorra and little microstates that don't have a lot of people to leave anyway. Pretty much every place in the world is sending people. When Todd was down in Costa Rica, he actually photographed these hotel registers. The town he was in isn't even really a town. It's kind of a smuggling lair. But they have informal hotels, motels, whatever you're going to call them, and people put down what country they're from. And Eritrea, Yemen, Cuba, Burkina Faso, you name it. I actually myself have spoken on the Sonoran side of the border, in other words, on the Mexican side opposite Arizona, at a migrant shelter, to a guy from Kazakhstan, to another from Kyrgyzstan, to a family, husband, wife, and kid from Russia, none of whom made any reference to being persecuted by anybody. It was just, they were just trying to use it as a way to get into the United States. And the interesting thing is the story changes once they cross the border. They're coached on what they're supposed to say. And the problem is that, the USCIS asylum officers who do that initial screening don't really want to know whether the story is particularly true or not, and the media simply report these stories uncritically. This isn't that surprising given that a big share of asylum officers are former social workers. And in fact, even the ones who weren't social workers, there's a kind of social worker sensibility to what a lot of the USCIS people, especially asylum officers, do. And this isn't just a problem because of regular lying by illegal immigrants. There's also a potential security threat here because a lot of these people are what are called special interest aliens, is the technical term. In other words, they're coming from countries that have real terrorism problems. Most of them obviously are not terrorists, but it's a whole lot more likely that they are than people from countries that aren't special interest countries. And the GAO has done a number of reports on this over the years, pointing out the fact that the asylum officers for USCIS are not trained or equipped, and I would add this myself, inclined to root out fraud. In fact, there's a kind of get to yes culture in USCIS that the current Homeland Security Secretary, when he was head of USCIS under 2 administrations ago, fostered. There really is a kind of, what can I do to get you into this car today, kind of car salesman. I mean, maybe that's the wrong analogy, but the point is they don't want to say no, they do want to say yes. And USCIS isn't completely unaware of this. There's actually a Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, FDNS they call it, which has serious people trying to identify fraud. One of the real problems is they can't arrest anybody. These are not investigators. They have no arrest authority. They can't present cases to U.S. attorneys. They have to beg ICE, specifically Homeland Security investigations within ICE, to do, to present cases. And this is a serious problem if they're going to be rooting out fraud. And I would add, just as a last point before we go to the congressman who will tell us about some of the things that Congress has considered on how to fix some of these problems, I would suggest that fraud in the asylum system is not merely endemic, it's systemic. The way the asylum system exists now cannot not have massive fraud, almost regardless of what we do. And that's why I've suggested in a piece I wrote a couple months ago that it's long past time for the United States to withdraw from the Protocol on Refugees. It's the UN treaty that relates to refugees. It's the follow-on treaty from the one that was written right after World War II. And it is basically, our current asylum and refugee system is an anachronism. It's a Cold War holdover, and we're long overdue in withdrawing from this treaty, which, like any treaty we can do, it was ratified in the late 60s. The protocol was written in 67. I believe we signed it in 68. It was ratified in 69 by the Senate. It was a whole different world then. There were no asylum seekers. Asylum seekers were, the ballerina who defected from the Soviet Union. I mean, you could count them on the fingers of both hands. We don't live in that world anymore, and yet we are governed by an asylum system that is based on the assumptions and the conditions of that world. Once we withdraw from the UN treaty, we can then, through our elected representatives, come up with an asylum system that actually reflects the American national interest.